Outdoorsmen have this generally unspoken code that no matter what, you never leave anybody stranded out of the wilderness. If you're out in the bush, you hear somebody and they need help, they're lost, they're hurt, you pretty much drop what you're doing and you do everything you can to help that person get to safety, to help them out. And the fellow in today's story, he lived by that code, but following that code, he found himself in an incredibly dangerous situation. But before we get to that encounter, if you found an encounter or know a story you'd like to have shared here on the show, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, gently slap that like button. And if you haven't done so already, especially if you're a return viewer, hit that subscribe button. While you're at it, let one fly at that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. John grew up in the small town of Decorah, Iowa, and from a very young age, he was a very avid deer hunter. From the very first time that his father took him out to the farm, when he was about 12 years old, he just absolutely fell in love with deer hunting, and from that point on, fall had become his favorite season, and every year he looked forward to the fall because that meant he got to go hunting with his dad. Once he got a little bit older, into his late teens, early 20s, he started working. He started to save up most of his vacation time, and he would take 1 or 2 weeks during the deer season to go off to the farm, spend some time out of the bush, and it was really his escape from everyday life. It was just something he absolutely enjoyed doing, something he loved. And when he was about 22 years old, he decided, you know what, I need a different challenge. So he started to make this switch from hunting with a firearm to hunting with a compound bow. And that first year archery hunting, he managed to tag a pretty decent buck. And from that moment on, he just was obsessed with archery hunting. It was a completely different challenge than he was used to. And just something about going off into the bush with just a stick and string really resonated within John. And it was like a newfound passion for hunting. Like, he still loved hunting, but it was just something about archery hunting just triggered this response in him that just ignited this unprofound love of the sport. Just this challenge, just being out of the bush, doing something that a lot of other hunters really don't have the skill to do. And he really prided himself on being able to go out with his bow and tag a deer. Now, John was very selective with who he would hunt with. He pretty much just hunted with his father. If he was not hunting with his father, he hunted solo. Very occasionally, he would go off with a buddy, but it just did not have the same feel to him. He just really enjoyed the time with his dad and his time solo out in the bush because, again, it was just his escape from real life. It was his way to decompress, his way to forget about all of his problems. And he found when he would go with a friend or a couple of friends, it just felt different to him. It felt more like a camping trip, felt more like just hanging out with the boys. And it did not really feel like he was out on his hunting adventures that he just grew up loving doing. And as John got up there in age to his mid-20s, to his late 20s, when he would be hunting with his father would basically pass on a lot of knowledge and a lot of tips onto John. Stuff like survival tactics, how to read sign. And one thing that his father always stressed to him pretty much from the time that he was really young was that if you're ever out in the bush and you happen to see or hear somebody that needs help, you basically drop what you're doing and you help them. They're your number one priority. You have to get them out of the bush and you leave nobody stranded out in the wilderness. That was something that just really was engraved into John's person, into his soul from his father. And it was something that he held incredibly dearly. As John started to go out hunting more and more by himself as his father got up there in age, a lot of the lessons that his father taught him and a lot of that knowledge that he passed on really kind of just repeated in John's head every single time he was out. And by the time he was in his 30s, he was not your average weekend warrior deer hunter. He would be out in May, in June, running trail cameras. Through July and August, he'd be out scouting food plots, talking with farmers, patterning the deer's movement on this massive property that he hunted. And every year he would pick one specific buck to be his target buck for the year. And in 2011, the buck that he identified to be his target buck that year was this massive mainframe 5x5 10-point buck that he ended up naming High Top. And where he patterned this buck's movements was this massive cornfield that butted up against this dense bush line, where about 300 yards into the bush there was this dry creek bed, and he patterned his movements pretty much every night to coming out of the bush into the corn. So once archery season opened, he knew that's where he was going to set up, and that's where he was going to get High Top that year. So before season, he set his tree stand up along this one spot of the field where it went into a little bit of a point. He set up right in that corner, right along this huge trail where High Top would always come out, make his way into the corn. So he set his stand about 16 feet up in the air, and he figured that's where he would get his crack at this buck. Once opening day rolled around, he sat the morning hunt out. He knew that High Top was hitting that cornfield every night, and he knew that if he was to start going into the bush trying to see if he could cut him off in the morning, that he would really hamper his chances of getting a crack at him, because now his scent would be through the area. He might risk bumping him up. So that morning he decided he was just going to sleep in, and he was only going to go for the evening hunt. So he ended up leaving his place around 12 o'clock in the afternoon. He made the hour-and-a-half drive northeast to this farm that he grew up hunting. And this farm was absolutely massive. This farm was well over 2,000 acres, but it was that one specific spot of the farm that John always frequented, and it was right along that cornfield. So as he made his way down this gravel road towards the farm, he started to really kind of look out his windows, kind of peering into the various fields. There were some soybean fields, some alfalfa fields, really trying to see if there were any deer at all out on the feed earlier in the afternoon. He did not see anything, but as he made his way down the gravel road, he got to the spot where the road turned to the right. So he turned his truck, drove down the road, and he ended up parking about a mile down the road right at this other sharp turn. He parked his truck right up against the side of the bush. He got out, he got his gear on, grabbed his bow, and then very, very carefully and very silently and stealthily, he made his way along the bush line up to where that cornfield started. Once he got to the cornfield, he dipped through the ditch, he followed the tree line for about a half a mile to that point, climbed up in his stand, and he settled in for the evening's hunt. John sat there for that entire afternoon and into the evening, just looking out into the cornfield in front of him. But more so, he was paying attention to the gap in between the corn and the bushes, which was about 30 yards wide. So he would look over to his left, he'd look over to his right, paying attention for any deer coming out of the bush into that corn. And that entire afternoon and into the evening, right up until dark, John saw no deer activity at all. And that was really odd. And John, while he's up in his stand, was even admitting that to himself. He was kind of wondering, like, what the hell's happening? There's always tons of deer moving across this gap, going into the corn. Nothing's moving tonight. Like, the wind is perfect. The wind's from my back. Like, there's no way they're smelling me. Like, where are all the deer? It did make him feel a little uneasy, because he started to think, did coyotes or wolves move into the area? Did something push the deer out? Is something going on that I'm not aware of? But ultimately, he just basically brushed it off to, well, that's why they call it hunting, not harvesting. So right at dark, he ended up grabbing his bow off his bow hanger. He slung it over his shoulder. He stood up on his stand. He climbed down the ladder, got down onto the ground, and almost immediately, once his feet were on the ground, he noticed that pretty much all around him, he could not hear any sounds at all. He heard no crickets. He heard no birds. He didn't even hear any bugs. And he could not hear like any small rodents scampering through the grass. And that did not sit well with John at all. He kind of stood there for a second, just kind of looking around, really feeling a bit on edge, because it was not like the woods just to shut off like this. And he knew when that happened, it generally meant that there was a predator in the area. So John, he kind of took a deep breath, kind of held onto his bow, held onto his pack, turned, and he started following the bush line along that gap back up towards the gravel road. He made it about a quarter mile back towards the road. So now he's about halfway between the road and that corner when all of a sudden, off to his left, out in the corn, he thinks he hears somebody calling out. He thinks he hears a human voice. So he just immediately stops, looks in that direction, and he's just basically laser focused, paying attention, listening as hard as he can out in towards where he heard that voice, trying to figure out, did he hear something? Was it maybe something he stepped on? Just the way the leaves rustled, maybe it sounded like a voice. So he stood there for a second, just kind of looking in that direction, when all of a sudden he heard a human voice coming from deep inside the cornfield, and it sounded like this person was calling for help. John just kind of immediately just alerted. He kind of stood up, still looking in that direction, just basically yelled out, "Hello!" And almost immediately after yelling hello, he hears that voice call out help again. John at this point thinking, okay, there's somebody out in the corn, they need help. So he immediately grabs his bow, he lays it on the ground, he takes his pack off, puts it on the ground, pulls a flashlight out, turns it on, starts shining it into the corn, but he cannot see anything at all. The corn's just way too thick. So John, again, he just yells out, "Hello, where are you?" And he hears this voice again yell, "Help." And it sounds like it's not that far away. It only sounds like it's maybe 50, 60 yards into the corn. John at this point is thinking, this is probably the farmer. The farmer was probably out walking through the corn, stepped in a hole, broke his leg, he's hurt. Something happened to him, but he's definitely hurt. That's why he's calling for help. And that's probably why I saw no deer tonight. So John very slowly starts making his way up towards the corn. He's holding his flashlight out in front of him. He gets right to the edge of the corn and he yells out again, "Hello, where are you?" And again, he hears that voice just yell, "Help." But this time, the voice sounded like it came from a little bit of a different direction. It was no longer like right in front of him. It sounded like it actually moved a little bit more to the right, closer towards the road. John at this point is wondering, like, what the hell's going on? He's called out to this guy multiple times, and now this person's moved a good 50, 75 yards closer towards the road. They're still calling for help, so he's figuring, you know what, this person, they can't be hurt that bad. Maybe they're not hurt. Maybe they're just lost to the corn, but I still need to help them. So thinking that this person was lost to the corn, John, he just started yelling out, "This way, over here, come this way, come towards my voice." But this person out in the corn just kept repeating, "Help me, help me, help me." John is completely confused by this, wondering why this person's not saying anything else, why they're not making any effort at all to come closer to him. So he just kind of stood there for a second, just being completely silent, listening to see if he could hear them walking through the corn, figure out, where they're actually moving to, and seeing if he could figure out what exactly is going on. So he's standing there for a few seconds, just listening in the direction of this voice, and he could hear the corn stalks actually cracking and falling over, and it sounded like whoever was out there was fairly large. Like, it was not just a small person. Like, whoever this was a bigger person. And he started to think, like, there's no way this could be the farmer. The farmer, he's like 70 years old. He's a very, very small man. He's only like 5'8", weighs maybe 120 pounds. Whoever this is out in the corn, they're a lot bigger. Whoever this is has to be like well over 200 pounds. And there's just no way this is the farmer. So again, he calls out saying, "I'm over here, come this way." And there's no response aside from this person saying, "Help me, help me." But now it sounds like this person has turned again and is now moving further away from him. John at this point, just completely frustrated, kind of lets out a sigh, figuring, great, I'm going to have to go into the corn to go find this guy. And that was something he really did not really want to do, because once you're in a cornfield, you cannot tell directions. The corn's way too high. You can't see anything around you. And John knew that going into the corn, there was a good chance that he was going to get turned around, Yeah, he wouldn't get lost permanently. He'd be able to pick a direction, walk in it, but it would be a major inconvenience. He could pop out of the corn like a half a mile away, and then have to walk all the way around. Or he could be kind of stuck walking in circles because he knew going in there, he could not walk in a straight line. He'd have to zigzag around, move the corn shoots out of the way as he made his way deeper in. So, with a big breath and a kind of a sigh of frustration, John took his first step into the corn, moving the first stalk out of the way, shining his light out in front of him, and very slowly he continued trying to head in a straight line towards where he heard that person's voice. Periodically, he would stop, he would call out, he'd say, "Hey, I'm over here, where are you?" And then he would just listen. And every single time he would do that, that person would just repeat, "Help me, help me." And John would just basically hang his head just in frustration because it sounded like every single time this person was just getting a little bit deeper out into the corn. So every time he would have to keep moving deeper and deeper into this cornfield until eventually he was a good almost 500 yards into the corn. And at this point, John was more than just frustrated. He was actually getting a little bit pissed off because this person just kept moving further away from him. So he stopped and he ended up yelling out basically, "Stop effing moving. I'm coming to help you. Just stop moving. Where are you?" When all of a sudden that voice that was calling, "Help me," called out again, but this time it was not from in front of him. It was coming from behind him, and it sounded like it was only a good 20-25 yards behind him. John immediately swung around with his flashlight, shining it back in the direction he came, but all he could see were all the corn stalks. So John basically just looked in that direction and he started running through the corn towards this person. He was at this point figuring this person was just playing with him, and he was actually pretty angry. He wanted to confront this person for basically wasting his time. So he ran through the corn in that direction. He ran to this one spot about 25-30 yards away where there was a whole bunch of the corn stalks were basically flattened out in this big circle. It was about 15 yards wide by about 15 yards. Just this big circle of all this flattened corn. And when he got into that little clearing, he just immediately stopped. He had his flashlight up and his eyes just went wide. What was in front of him was not a person. There was this weird palish white gray creature kind of all hunched over on all fours, but it had what appeared to be deer antlers coming off the top of its head, and it had its head kind of turned away from him. But he could tell just by looking at this thing that this thing was no normal animal. This thing looked almost like a weird humanoid creature with these antlers coming out of his head. John, he just stood there with his flashlight up, staring at this thing just in utter disbelief of what's in front of him, when all of a sudden this thing turns its head, looks directly at him. John, in this moment, he just felt this overwhelming feeling of dread. He felt his heart rate just picking up. This creature in front of him, no more than 10 yards away, had these dark, sunken-in eyes, these massive teeth, and it was the way it was down on all fours. He could still see its fingers and had these massive claws on it. When all of a sudden, this thing, it opened its mouth and said, "Help me," to John, but in John's voice. John, upon hearing this, kind of slowly started backing up. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know if he should turn and run back the way he had just come from, deeper into the corn, if he should run off to the side. John really had nothing to protect himself with. He had a small knife, he had a can of bear spray. So out of a final act of pretty much desperation, he reached down to his side, he pulled up his bear spray, pointed it towards this creature, and he pretty much emptied the entire can at this thing. This thing's reaction was pretty much immediately to grab at its face, grab towards its eyes. It started rolling around on the ground, and it was just screeching and squealing and screaming. John used this thing's reaction as basically his chance to try to get out of there. So at a very slight angle away from this creature, he started running in the direction that he figured his truck was in. As he was running through the corn, he had to kind of move all the stalks out of the way. The entire time, he could hear this thing behind him squealing and screaming, and John was just hoping that he picked the right direction, that he was not running deeper into the corn, because he knew that that one direction, if he ran in it, he would be running for about a mile, and he did not want to be stuck in the corn with whatever the hell that was, not being able to see. John just continued to just run through the corn as fast as he could, when all of a sudden behind him, he no longer heard that screaming, he no longer heard that screeching, but he heard that creature basically yelling, "Help me, help me, help me," in his voice, very quickly coming up behind him. John, at this point, basically, he just mustered up all the energy he had left, and he just basically went into a full sprint as fast as he could. He was no longer moving those stalks out of the way. He was just plowing through them, and the entire time, he could hear this thing getting closer behind him. When he got to the edge of the cornfield, luckily, he did pick the right direction. As he came out of the bush, he could see just down the road, only about 150 yards, was his truck. John immediately turned, started sprinting towards the truck. Again, the entire time, he could hear this thing getting closer and closer behind him. John, though, once he got to his truck, he managed to open up the door. He got in, started it up, and as soon as he started it up, he happened to look in his driver's side mirror, and he could see this thing basically right behind the driver's side of his truck, rapidly coming up towards his door. John immediately just threw the truck in gear, floored it, and took off down this gravel road, shooting gravel up at this thing. And you could see that the gravel hitting this creature behind him was kind of caused the creature to kind of move back a bit. Again, it started shielding at his face, and he saw in his mirror this thing turn and ran back into the bush along the side of that cornfield. John ended up spinning his truck around, headed back up towards the highway, and headed all the way home. The next day, John ended up calling that farmer and basically asked him if he had seen anything weird on his property. And the farmer said, "Well, I haven't seen anything weird, but every once in a while I could hear somebody calling for help." John told the farmer, "If you hear somebody calling for help," he said, "don't go after it." He said, "That's not a person. I don't know what the hell it is, but it's not a person. It's some type of monster. Just don't go towards it. And, I think we need to get somebody out here to see what this thing is." But the farmer basically did not believe John. He just said, "No, I think there's just one of the neighbors wandering around through the fields. Whatever you saw, that has nothing to do with what I've been hearing." John tried to stress this to the farmer, but the farmer just would not listen. John at that point decided, you know what? I love hunting, but I don't know what that was. That thing, it should not exist. And he decided at that point that his hunting days were pretty much over. Even to this day, John will not go anywhere near a cornfield. He does not like to go in the woods, but he will especially not go near any cornfields at night. He did some research, and what he thinks he encountered that night out in that cornfield was a Wendigo or possibly a Skinwalker. Well, that's it for today's encounter. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think it was that John encountered out in that cornfield? Do you think this was a Wendigo? Do you think it was a Skinwalker? Do you think it was a Rake? Or do you think this was something completely different? I'd really like to know your thoughts, so please let me know those. As always, though, if you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button. While you're at it, let one fly at that notification bell, and I'll see you next time.